Okay. Keep forgetting always says that. Well, welcome everybody. Our guest tonight is Andrew Woodmansey. He's actually originally from the UK. Andrew enjoyed many family caravan holidays in the United Kingdom and as well as all around Europe as a child. He immigrated with his family to Australia in 2000. He's now semi-retired. Andrew enjoys his main two hobbies of writing about the history of recreational vehicles and exploring the beauty of Australia by caravan. Andrew lives in Sydney, Australia, and he wrote our current recently published book, The Curtis Aerocar, 1928 to 1940, published by Schlifford Publishing in September 2024. It's currently available in our museum gift shop if you ever want to pick that up or check it out. It's a really, really well-produced book. Anyways, Andrew, feel free to take it away. Really interested and excited about your presentation tonight.
Thank you for that, and thank you everybody for joining today. I wanted to talk about the Curtis Aerocar in a slightly different way to the book. So I've called the presentation The Untold Story of the Curtis Aerocar. So why have I chosen that title? Well, for three reasons. The first reason is that Glenn Curtis, I think as most of us know, had so many other achievements during his lifetime that the Aerocar has sort of got squeezed out of the history of his achievements because the other achievements were so incredible and so long-lasting. So the Aerocar typically would have been a lifelong achievement for most ordinary mortals, but for Glenn Curtis, it was something that was just one of his many achievements over his lifetime. The second reason why we know traditionally so little about the Aerocar is because the information about the Aerocar is spread across many different places. So quite a bit of detective work is needed to find out how the Aerocar started, what caused Glenn Curtis to create this incredible road vehicle. And you have to go looking in a lot of archives around the US, which are only now beginning to be revealed through online databases and archives being made available, which is wonderful. So we do live in a great time from that point of view. And the third reason is that the Curtis Museum's own archives, as you know, are not really digitized. So you actually have to go and physically visit the museum in order to look through the files and the boxes, which Rick Leisenring has so patiently put together over decades. And it's such an amazing resource. And I do hope that one day that archive will be digitized so that everybody around the world can get to enjoy some of the stories behind Glenn Curtis. So this is the cover of my first recreational vehicle history book. There's not many RV historians around the world. It's a very niche field, as you can imagine. And this is a book that I wrote in 2022. And Rick was helpful in producing the US chapter of that book, and particularly the Curtis Aerocar pages. And so after finishing that book, he said, would you like to write a history of the Curtis Aerocar? And I was honored and delighted to do so. So this latest book is the sequel, if you like, to the RV history book of 2022. This is the Aerocar that most of you will be familiar with. It's the one that sits in the museum belonging to Mr. and Mrs. W.T. Sampson Smith. And all credit to the museum for getting hold of one of these very rare remaining Aerocars, and also for leaving it in original condition, which allows visitors to see some of the original design intent. And although it's known as being a luxury RV, including lots of luxury items such as refrigerators, cigar lighters, drinks cabinets, It had surprisingly modest origins. So this is really the story that I'd like to cover today. This is the new book, as Andre has already mentioned, it's been really well produced by Schiffer Publishing and lovely gold lettering on a matte black background. So it sits alongside its sister publication, which is Rick's book on motorcycles, which is also a fascinating read. So they came out as a pair at the end of September and available in the museum gift shop. So let's have a look at the story of the Aerocar, particularly its early days. And I wondered, why would Glenn Curtis, who was specialist in aviation, build a road vehicle? And I wanted to find out not only what happened with the Aerocar, but why it happened. So this is the first page of chapter 2 of my book, and it's called Auto Intoxication. So what does that mean? Well, I hope you can read some of the words underneath the title, but it was Glenn Curtis's description of how he felt after many long hours in an automobile. And it didn't matter whether he was driving or whether he was a passenger. He became exhausted by road travel. If you can imagine in the 1910s, that he was traveling all around the country doing air shows, demonstrating new types of plane, new engines, and he would have to travel a lot by road. And he called the feeling of being in a car for a long time auto intoxication. And he said that in a later interview in 1929, he made some strong criticisms of the modern automobile design of the time. And he said, "We've been grossly extravagant in motorcar design. We have developed tires with a 56-inch tread, a gargantuan and cumbersome motor, over a ton of steel, and a kaleidoscope of trimmings, wheels, oversized fenders, lights and fittings, all taking up enough space to house a Nairobi family. It still costs more to travel per mile than it did with a 4-horse team and a coach a century ago."
National security and spy agencies. The framework tells agencies to
So that
other
was
uses, like applications that would violate civil rights or other.
So that was quite an outspoken statement from Glenn Curtis. As many of you know, he was a true gentleman and was very modest and cautious in making criticisms, and he would often spend more time encouraging his employees and friends to move on to greater things rather than criticize people. So to criticize automobile design in that way was quite radical for him. So he must have felt quite strongly about that. And this is a quote from Colonel James Prentice, who was an army balloonist who retired to Florida and became friends with Curtis during his time in Florida. And he observed that Curtis seemed to have a perfect horror of the engine and road vibrations, which suggests to me that perhaps Glenn Curtis may have suffered from some form of PTSD from his flying days. He had many near misses in his planes, and clearly witnessed a lot of friends and colleagues unfortunately diving to their death in planes that have been untried and untested. And this must have affected him very deeply. And I do wonder whether PTSD was a factor in him wanting to improve automobile design. So we go on to Curtis's first attempts to improve the design of automobiles. This is 4 photos which are from 1912 to 1916. And Curtis didn't build these automobiles. He sent some designs to a bodybuilder called Brun and Co. in Buffalo. And they made these changes to standard production automobiles at Curtis's request. So you can begin to see how Glenn Curtis is already introducing aerodynamic curves to the roof and the back of some of these cars. The one in the top left is a Marmon 34, and I don't know that it's clear from the photo, but the windscreen is actually V-shaped in order to deflect the air either side to increase the aerodynamic properties. The sides and the pillars of that car were removable to increase airflow on sunny days. The Pierce Arrow in the top right had a sloping rear, and the Cadillac town car, the bottom left, had a long front end to keep the passengers as far away from the noisy engine as possible. And the bottom right is another Pierce Arrow, and again it had the V-shaped windscreen, it had wheel covers and a rounded rear end. So if you can imagine that this was all happening, these designs were coming out in the mid-1910s, and that streamlining did not really take off as a movement in the automobile industry in the US until about 1930. So you can see how far ahead Glenn Curtis was of the industry. The next slide shows some attempts after the First World War to utilize the surplus OX5 aircraft engine, which is pictured bottom right, in automobiles. So clearly there was a lot of cancelled orders when the war ended for Curtis aircraft, and along with that, a lot of surplus OX5 engines. So there was a modest attempt to try and fit some of these engines into production cars. And Curtis actually formed something called the Curtis Motorcar Company in 1921 for this purpose. And it was not very successful, I have to say. There was clearly a lot of challenges trying to shoehorn an aircraft engine into an automobile, and it must have shaken the passengers to pieces. And according to automobile historian Keith Marvin, there was only about 14 of these conversions that took place. And that was cut short partly by the depression that took place in the early 20s, and partly by Curtis's move to Florida in 1920. And a little bit later on, this automobile comes from the late 1920s, probably 1929. And this is another little incredible find from the Curtis Museum. That old battered model of a vehicle that you see in the top right is actually in a shoebox in the archives in the basement of the museum, along with some drawings on the left-hand side. And I think this is Curtis's attempt to use a front-wheel drive automobile. In this case, it was a Cord L29 Coupe built by Auburn, and to bring, again, streamlining properties. If you look at that rear end, it is very, very long and raked. And to try and use front-wheel drive, which he said has great promise, to keep the engine way at the front and the passengers at the back, and to try and make life a bit more comfortable for long drives. But that didn't go anywhere. I don't think there's any pictures other than the bottom picture there, which is, we think that the 29 prototype ended up in an accident and was restored a few years later in 1933. And we think that photo is of that restored vehicle. This photo is one that I like a lot because it's called the Curtiss Motor Vehicle Prototype in 1930, and this was perhaps one of the last inventions of Glenn Curtiss before his death in 1930. This is another front-wheel drive, but this is, I think, what was going to become the Aerocar house car. So not a fifth wheeler, but a one-box design with, again, front-wheel drive, an articulated suspension mechanism underneath, which he started designing in 1925. And this was going to be a one-box vehicle for recreation, for business executives to sit in the back while being chauffeured to work. And this, I think, had Curtiss lived beyond 1930, would have become the first one-box recreational vehicle in the world. If you think to the Volkswagen Combi, which did not emerge until around 1950, this is a vehicle that came out 20 years earlier and would have revolutionized the recreational vehicle industry in the States, if not beyond. And it's just an amazing design and shows how far ahead of his time Glenn Curtiss was. So we'll go back a little bit in time now and talk about some of Curtiss's recreational vehicles. And as we know, Curtiss was a keen hunter, and he wanted to get to remote hunting areas and needed a vehicle to help him do that. So he went to design a camping car. And although the first camping car that he did produce was a fifth wheeler, these three diagrams show that Curtiss, along with his half-brother, G. Carl Adams, also experimented with house cars. So again, a truck basically with a recreational vehicle bed built onto the back of it. And in this case, with the Pullman beds, if you look in the bottom right diagram, the Pullman beds drop down very similar to Pullman cars in railway carriages. But this never, as far as we know, we've never come across any photos of this in existence. So I think this was just a design exercise that never saw the light of day. But what did see the light of day was this wonderful vehicle. This is the Curtiss Camp Car of 1919. And it is the first fifth wheeler that we know, are aware of, was used for recreational purposes in the US. So you can see on the front there, there's I think that's a deer that has been hunted, slung to the side of the tow vehicle. And you can see somebody changing a rear tire. But what is interesting to me, I did a sort of a zoom into the back of that tow vehicle. And I was interested to see whether Glenn Curtiss in 1919 was already designing his own fifth wheel hitch mechanism. But it seems to me that he had not yet reached that stage. That came later. And that's why I've put a little inset in the top right of a commercial hitch called the Martin Rocking Fifth Wheel. And you can see on the back of the tow vehicle, it looks very, very similar to that Martin Rocking with Fifth Wheel. So it looks like Curtiss used a commercial product to start out his fifth wheel trailer journey. So why did he choose a fifth wheel design? This is something I hope you can read. This is another quote from Colonel James Prentice that he made much later in 1930. But I'll read it very quickly just in case you can't see the text very well. He wrote, "This trailer was a remarkably light and ingenious affair. He had noticed that when they hauled airplanes along the roads by putting the landing skid of the tail end onto a truck, the tools, etc., in the airplane fuselage had shaken very little, and that men who rode on the planes said there was very little vibration. Some even fell to sleep while being hauled from shops to fields and vice versa. So here is a man, Glenn Curtis, who is heavily involved in the aircraft manufacturing and flying industry. And here's his powers of observation, where he notices that when these aircraft are towed front to back from factory to airfield and vice versa, the pilots fell asleep. And from that, he assumed and maybe had personal experience of how comfortable this configuration was. So he decided to try and use that configuration in his own recreational vehicles. And I've tried long and hard to try and find a photo of an aircraft being towed backwards at Hammondsport. But the only one I could find was unfortunately from the wrong side of World War I. But you can see how the aircraft in this photo is sitting on the back of the tow truck and is basically in a fifth wheel configuration. So the hitch sits right above the rear axle of the tow vehicle, which is the classic configuration of a fifth wheel. And the hitch is not behind the tow vehicle, which introduces all kind of swaying issues. And it is remarkable to me how an aircraft being towed in this way seemed to be the inspiration for Curtis's fifth wheel designs. This was the closest I could come to of a photograph of an aircraft being towed at Hammondsport. So if any of you ever come across any better photos of the archive of a plane being towed backwards, please let me know. The recreational vehicle that Curtis came up with in 1920 for production, actually, he moved away from the fifth wheel concept because he found that the Curtis camp car was too big and heavy. Despite being a fifth wheeler, it was still too big, and it tended to sink in the sand and in the swamps of the areas that he would go hunting in. So this is the Adams Motor Bungalow, which is a much simpler design. You can see it's got a more conventional hitch behind the rear of the tow vehicle. And it is just a high quality and quite expensive camping trailer, but still a camping trailer. And these were put into production in 1920, and Carl Adams was given the job of producing these, and basically was treated by Glenn Curtis as his baby brother, even though he was a half brother. I think there was about 19 years difference in age between them. So he would take him under his wing and teach him everything he knew about engineering and aircraft and trailers and running a business. So this is why it was called the Adams Motor Bungalow. It wasn't a great success. Only about 100 were produced. They were too expensive for people who wanted to experiment with automobile camping for the first time. You could pick one of these up in the late 1910s for about $75 in those days. So at $400 to $500, these were a lot more expensive, and people weren't really ready for luxuries of that kind. But Curtis did not give up the fifth wheel concept altogether, and he started to experiment with applying the fifth wheel concept not just to recreation, but also to passenger buses. And this is the Curtis trailer bus, a lovely photo from the Curtis archives of 1922. And this again is a fifth wheel configuration, and you can just about see that the fifth wheel sits on top of the driver's seat. It's right underneath the driver, and there was a door on the side for passengers to come in and sit down. And this was a bus I think maybe only 2 were produced, but they were taken down to Florida and used to transport potential real estate investors from downtown Miami to Curtis's properties in Florida. And this is what the inset photo in the top left is doing. You can see that Curtis trailer bus full of potential real estate investors. They would be taken to the auction that would be on site, and lots would be sold on the morning, and in many cases they got resold several times more by the end of the day. But the time that Curtis spent in Florida, I really enjoyed researching about this, because it's not a period that you see is dealt with extensively in most of the other Curtis biographies. But although most people call it Curtis's retirement, it was anything but. It was actually one of his busiest periods of his life. And he did get involved in real estate, but I would say more as a community developer rather than as a real estate speculator. He was interested in building communities, in creating jobs and year-round employment for people that lived in the area. And this is quite a grainy photo, but this is Glenn Curtis standing in front of a papaya tree. And what is not well described in Curtis biographies is how much Curtis became involved in agriculture in Florida. He felt that agriculture was an important industry to support the tourist industry, and that it was very important to develop some of the areas away from the beachfront areas in order to give housing and employment to people who live there. And looking through newspapers.com, which is a great resource for people like me, you get lots of headlines from the 1920s, and these are just some examples of the agricultural exploits that Glenn Curtis pursued in the 1920s. So you can see top left, he tried to create a mohair goat industry. I don't think that went very well. Probably from his time in Hammondsport, he tried to grow grapes in Florida, and that did take off, but not straight away. Further down, you can see he started sowing seeds by aeroplane, which is typical of Glenn Curtis. He also created some land on the bottom right there at a place called Brighton, where farmers could farm land at very low cost. Brighton was well to the north of Miami because some of his land around Miami itself was subject to flooding, and Brighton was much less exposed to flooding risk. And this is an advert for his Brighton site in Florida on the left-hand side. And there was a dairy farm on the top right, and some of the activities on the bottom right. So Brighton included a hotel, a dude ranch, hunting opportunities, and a zoo. You can imagine being able to do hunting and visit a zoo in the same place today. I can't imagine that. But most importantly for the story of the Aerocar, Brighton was a truck farming cooperative where the farmers would sell their produce to the Curtis Bright cooperative, and the cooperative would own some trucks and take them into Miami each day and sell the produce to downtown hotels and stores. So just hold on to that thought for 1 second, because I have to divert to another personality in the Curtis Aerocar story, a gentleman called Carl Fisher. So Carl Fisher, some of you will know of him. He was an automobile lover, a racing car driver, He made his millions from the sale of the Prestolite headlamp company, and he was an investor in the Indianapolis Raceway. Most importantly, he was a superb promoter. He was the founder of Miami Beach and owned a number of properties and hotels in and around Miami. But he was also very well connected to what's called the gasoline aristocracy of Detroit. And that's a connection that comes in very handy in the months ahead. And so why Carl Fisher? Well, let's come back to Brighton, and let's come back to those trailers that took the farming produce into Miami each day. I think, although it's not described as such, I think Carl Fisher is the person in the center of this photo with a bow tie. And for whatever reason, Glenn Curtis took Carl Fisher for a ride in one of his farming trailers. So you can see Brighton Valley Farms on the side of the trailer. You can see very clearly it's a fifth wheel trailer where the hitch is actually, in this case, slightly forward of the rear axle, not on top of it. And you can see bottom left that it's very similar to the Curtis camp car of 1919. And I don't know whether you can read the text that I put bottom right. I'll just read the first part very quickly. This is a letter from Carl Fisher to Roy Chapin, who is the chairman of the Hudson Motorcar Company. Enclosed, fine copy of letter to Glenn Curtis. Glenn Curtis has the greatest trailer that was ever made in America. It is the cheapest thing built. It is absolutely noiseless. It has a coupler joint that is as simple as an old shoe, but it is perfectly wonderful. This trailer is going to revolutionize touring in this country. So there we have, on the one hand, Glenn Curtis interested in agriculture, interested in creating communities, employment, and year-round activity in Florida. And on the other hand, you have this promoter supreme, Carl Fisher, who is always on the lookout for the next great idea. And you put the two together, and it is, in fact, Carl Fisher who says, this is something that you need to develop and sell as a product to Glenn Curtis. And we know that Glenn was happy to oblige. This photo is actually in the book and is one of my favorite photos. This is actually what I'm calling Aerocar #1. It's a bit hard to see because it's quite a dark photo, but this is actually the farming trailer that has been repainted on the side with advertising for Glenn Curtis properties in Florida. So the intention here was that this vehicle would be taken as a rolling billboard around some of the northern states to try and attract more farmers and more investment into Florida. And for this first time, we actually see the word Aerocar being used in connection with what was effectively a farm trailer. You can just about see on the bottom the words Aerocar in the middle of those two lines of text. You can also see on the upper left, you can see the word car. And I suspect that the word aero is on the far side of the car. So this is really the first vehicle that was named the Aerocar. And bottom left is actually the first logo of the Aerocar Corporation. And you can see on the side of this vehicle the wing and the tire combination for the very first time that was adapted for the Aerocar. So it wasn't too long after Carl Fisher's intervention that production got underway of the first Aerocars. And this is a rare and hard to find photo of the first Aerocar factory in Opa-locka, which is one of Curtis's properties and towns. And this was actually, I think, an unused factory space that was adapted for Aerocar production, and they were producing apparently 3 Aerocars a week in 1928. So not much to look at, but from a historical point of view, very significant. These photos show how quickly the Aerocar concept evolved. These are some of the earliest Aerocars that were manufactured in 1928 and 1929. The top left photo is one of Carl Fischer's ideas. He basically said, we've got to get the Aerocar to compete with the railroads. And I bet that the Aerocar can travel from Miami to New York faster than the railroad can. So to demonstrate that, they had a Miami to New York test run with lots of advertising, lots of stops along the way, and lots of publicity in each town that they passed through. And that started on the 5th of August in 1928. And that journey was completed in 38 hours and 7 minutes. So at the time, that was pretty fast. On the top right is Glenn Curtis standing in front of an early Aerocar in Hammondsport. So although the early Aerocars were built primarily in Florida, Hammondsport was used to make improvements and modifications, turn out new parts for these vehicles. And again, it was creating more employment in Hammondsport in the late 20s. Bottom left, you can see streamlining beginning and an attempt to try and create a vehicle that looked like one vehicle, even though it's with the sloping roof coming over the chauffeur's compartment, even though it was clearly a fifth wheeler. And the Zeppelin was all the rage at the time, and dirigibles were highly fashionable. So the rear of that Aerocar was made to look like a balloon. And the last picture, bottom right, is I don't know if you can see, but there's a rear observation deck at the back of that Aerocar, and that was built for Carl Fischer in 1929. You can see from these wonderful photos at the Curtis Museum the connection between aircraft construction and Aerocar construction. So this is an Aerocar sideways on, and you can see how the wooden struts and the turnbuckles, similar to those used in the Curtis Jenny, were carried over into the Aerocar, which is quite remarkable, because if you think that the Curtis Jenny would have been more than a decade old by that stage, and here is Glenn Curtis bringing back a decade-old aircraft construction technique into the Aerocar. But he did it because it was light, it was cheap, it was the technology that he knew, and he could put these together very quickly. And this is, to me, this is the star of the Aerocar, which is the Aero Coupler, which is Glenn Curtis's fifth wheel hitch. And once again, in the top left, we can see the aircraft tire, which was mounted in a wooden block. The tire was inflated, mounted horizontally onto the rear of the tow vehicle, and then a pin at the front of the Aerocar was dropped into the center of the tire. And lo and behold, the Aero Coupler would absorb all sorts of shocks, left, right, forward, back, up and down. Everything was absorbed and made a significant contribution to the comfort of the Aerocar. And I think it's a wonderful invention. The Aero Coupler evolved during the life of the Aerocar, as you would expect. Underneath the wooden frame version is the aluminum framed version that came in much later. And then around 1932, on the bottom right, is a fairing which helped the aerodynamic properties at the front of the Aerocar, so it could slip through the air more easily. So I had originally thought that the Aerocar was a wonderful recreational vehicle, but it turned out from the research that it was so much more than that. It was used for all sorts of other purposes. This is one of the first commercial, probably the first commercial Aerocar, which is a candy car in 1928. I think it was Paul Ogden, who was a candy jobber in the local area, and he fitted out his Aerocar with all sorts of candy, and he would take that around his area, and probably found that he sold a lot more candy because he had a mobile store instead of one that didn't move. So from candy stores, we move on to freight work, passenger transport we've seen, and even garbage collection and horse transport. This is a photo, I think, which is included in the display at the museum, which is the Aerocar being used as ground transportation for the newly emerging airlines of the late 1920s. And this was, in fact, a Curtiss idea to transport airline passengers between hotels and airports, because at that time planes could only fly during the daytime. Commercial passenger planes could only fly during the daytime. So passengers had to sleep in hotels and be transported to the airfield the next morning. And a number of airlines, Transcontinental Air Transport, Southwest Air Fast Express, and Pan Am used Curtiss Aerocars. But the industry had a major setback in September 1929 when a TAT plane crashed, killing all 8 people on board. So it set back the industry by a fair few months. And then, of course, the stock market crash in 1929 made things even worse. So that usage didn't last too much longer. But with the onset of the Great Depression, one great use for the Aerocar was as a mobile retail store. So many merchants who had physical stores found that in the Depression they had to take the merchandise out to the customers, particularly in remote and rural areas. So this is a photo of a Friendly 5 Shoes Aerocar, and they were called Friendly 5 Shoes because no pair of shoes was more than $5. And you can see the shoe Aerocar attracting a lot of interest. This next photo is fascinating. It's a casket display Aerocar. So the Peoria Casket Company from about 1930 would fit out their I think only one, but their Aerocar with caskets and take them into rural areas so people could choose their caskets. The production of Aerocars also took place in Detroit. So luxury models tended to be made in Miami, while Detroit tended to make cheaper models to a fixed price point. And they were manufactured under license from Aerocar by Briggs Body Manufacturing Company, who was a contact of Carl Fisher's. These were more affordable than the Miami versions, and this was a Camping Express model that you see in the photo. More basic, more straightforward, but also more affordable. And the other end of the scale, we see a observation deck Aerocar. So this was the Aerocar intended for the millionaires of the 1930s. After Curtiss's death in 1930, the Aerocar Corporation really lost its way for some months, if not years, which is understandable. But in 1932, oil magnate Henry Docky acquired the Aerocar Corporation And as a major hotel and sports club owner in Miami, he ordered a fleet of at least 14 Aerocars to transport guests from the hotel to his sports clubs and around Miami. And the observation deck was proved very popular. It was basically a throwback to the aircraft origins of the Aerocar. So you went up a little staircase, and passengers would be able to see the view from above the tow vehicle, and there would be an odometer, a barometer, a thermometer, a range of instruments that you could look at whilst you were being towed by your chauffeur. The luxury models carried on in the 1930s. Despite the Great Depression, there was a lot of people who wanted these status symbols. And this Aerocar belonged to Dr. Hubert Eaton of Los Angeles. And it would be not uncommon for the millionaires of the day to also make sure that the tow vehicle matched the Aerocar. So this is a Rio Tow Vehicle from 1938. And it must have looked pretty stunning as it was driving down the road in the late 1930s. This photo, again, I like because it shows the combination of the Graf Zeppelin at the Opa-locka Naval Air Station and the Aerocars acting as ground transport, probably part of the fleet of Henry Doherty. And it shows the connection between the Aerocar and aviation quite nicely. And as we've seen, some of the earlier Aerocars were designed to look like dirigibles. And so quickly on to the last couple of slides. Sorry for taking so long, but this is from a brochure, but it shows one of the early Aerocars still being used to transport fruit and vegetables. So this is the Aerocar going back to its early roots. And this is a summary of what I think is the legacy of the Aerocar. It is far more significant than I think many people realized. It is the first production travel trailer in America, as far as I can recollect. Many people think that it was Arthur Sherman's covered wagon travel trailer, but that did not start production until 1930. So Glenn Curtis was producing the Aerocar 2 years before that. It was the first production fifth wheeler built for recreation. There was an earlier fifth wheeler built in Belgium in 1913, but that was a one-off and didn't go into production. So the production fifth wheeler came about with the Aerocar in 1928. It was the first production multi-purpose road vehicle. So again, commerce, passenger transport, horse transport, as well as recreation. All of these uses had never been brought under one roof, so to speak, for the first time. And I think most importantly, it was one of the lightest, fastest, and safest RVs ever built. The fifth wheel configuration is one of the safest ways of towing a travel trailer. And it is really a very, very safe way to go on holiday. And very few accidents happen in fifth wheelers compared to standard travel trailers. We don't know the exact numbers built because the numbering system was highly confusing between Florida and Detroit, but we think that about 1,000 Aerocars were built between 1928 and 1940. And just to finish off, is two fathers with their babies. That's me on the left with the Aerocar book, and Rick with his wonderful book on Curtis motorcycles. Two very happy people last month, and we hope that you'll feel able to go out and grab a copy. So that's the end of the show, and thank you for listening, and happy to take any questions.